Morning in Peppa Pig's house began differently than usual. She opened her eyes and immediately felt something was wrong. The room looked familiar, but the air was heavy, pressing, filled with a suffocating silence. George lay beside her, hugging his dinosaur, but she couldn't even hear his breathing. Peppa carefully got up and went downstairs. Normally, at this time, Mummy Pig would be making breakfast, and the house would be filled with the smell of porridge. But now, a different smell greeted her. Cold, empty, like a room where no one had lived for a very long time. Her family was waiting in the living room. Mummy, Daddy, and George sat on the sofa. They didn't move, they didn't speak. Their eyes were completely empty, like two black ovals, without reflection, without life. On their faces was the same wide, identical smile. They turned their heads toward Peppa all at once, and there was nothing natural in that movement. Peppa took a step back, and at that moment the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showed static, and then her reflection. Only it wasn't hers. The face on the screen was distorted, the eyes too big, the mouth twisted, and most terrifying of all, it didn't move the way she did. When Peppa blinked, the reflection kept staring with wide, unblinking eyes. When she raised her hoof, her copy did the same, but with a delay and at a strange angle, like a puppet pulled on strings. Sound filled the room. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't music. It was a jumble of distorted phrases, spoken backwards. They overlapped, merging into a droning noise that made her ears ache. Peppa covered them with her hooves, but the sound continued inside her head. Her family stood up from the sofa and took a step forward. Their movements were synchronized, which made it even more terrifying. Peppa ran upstairs into her room and slammed the door shut. But the mirror in her bedroom was already waiting for her. Inside was the same copy from the screen. It was moving faster now, scratching at the glass with its hooves from the inside. Cracks spread across the surface, and its lips began to move. At first, silently. Then, through the crackling, she heard words, backwards and barely recognizable. "Let me in." The mirror splintered. In panic, Peppa pulled back, clutching the doorknob. And at that instant, everything fell silent again. The silence was thick, buzzing. She slowly went downstairs. The kitchen greeted her with a new, horrifying sight. Sitting right on the table was Labubu. Her favorite toy had always seemed harmless, but now it looked different. Its eyes were hollow, black, and its smile stretched too wide, as if the fabric of its face was ready to rip apart. In Labubu's paws was George's torn dinosaur. Threads hung from it, and the plastic body was twisted into an unnatural pose. Peppa froze, unable to move. Labubu slowly lifted its head. Its mouth didn't move, but a long hissing sound came from within. Then it stretched its tiny paw toward Peppa. Fear paralyzed her. She felt she couldn't scream, couldn't run. Labubu tilted its head slightly, as if saying, "You knew it would come to this." She felt the walls of the house begin to tremble. Lights flickered on in the corridor by themselves. Shadows stretched across the walls, too long, moving as if they were copying her every gesture. The television turned on again, and this time the distorted Peppa didn't just appear on the screen. It began to crawl halfway out. Its lips stretched into a grin, and it winked. Peppa covered her face with her hooves. She understood this day would not end. It would repeat again and again. And Labubu, sitting on the table, was there to make sure of it. His eyes glowed red, his smile stretched even wider. He was waiting. It all started the day Peppa found a strange toy in her room. It was a labubu, a small yellow monster with big black eyes and sharp teeth. Peppa couldn't remember where it came from. "What a cute toy! Where did you come from, little one?" she asked. Labubu remained silent, but his black eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. That same day, a second window appeared in her room. The new window was old and dark, completely different from Peppa's usual window. Through the murky glass, instead of the familiar yard, there was a view of a gloomy, foggy forest. And strangest of all, in the forest grew trees that looked exactly like labubu toys. "Mummy, look at this window and this strange forest," Peppa called out. But Mummy Pig replied, "Peppa dear, there's only one window in your room. And what's that toy you're holding?" Mummy couldn't see the second window, but even stranger, she couldn't see the labubu toy either, even though Peppa was holding it right in front of her. On the first night, Peppa placed labubu on her bedside table and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, she woke up to a strange sound, the quiet grinding of teeth. In a quiet, creaky voice, Labubu whispered, "Peppa, Peppa, look out the window." You can talk," Peppa gasped. She turned to the second window. In the forest, she saw hundreds of small yellow figures, exactly like her toy. They stood between the trees, staring directly at her. Every night, the army of toy labubus in the forest grew larger. They moved closer to the window, and their black eyes glowed in the darkness like little stars. "We've come for you, Peppa. You found us. Now we'll find you," Labubu said. "What do you want from me?" Peppa asked fearfully. "We want you to become one of us, forever," came the chilling reply. On the third night, Peppa woke up to find her hands had turned yellow, like Labubu's, and her eyes in the mirror seemed bigger and blacker than usual. "What's happening to me?" she cried. "You're becoming one of us. Soon you'll be able to live in our forest and we'll play forever," Labubu explained with a sinister smile. Peppa tried to throw away the Labubu toy, but it always returned to her room. She tried to close the second window, but it appeared on other walls. "Mummy! Daddy! Help me!" she screamed. But her parents couldn't see Labubu or hear his voice. To them, Peppa was just talking to herself. On the seventh night, the Labubu army came right up to the window. There were so many of them that the forest glowed with the yellow light of their bodies and the black gleam of their eyes. In chorus, they chanted, "It's time, Peppa. Time to join us." Peppa looked at herself in the mirror. Her skin had turned completely yellow. Her eyes were big and black, and the same horrifying smile as Labubu's appeared on her face. I'm ready," she said in a voice that now sounded like Labubu's. The second window opened by itself. Cold wind from the Labubu forest rushed into the room. Peppa, now looking more like a toy than a pig, stepped toward the window and disappeared into the night. In the morning, Mummy Pig came into Peppa's room to wake her up, but the bed was empty. On the windowsill lay only a small yellow Labubu toy with big black eyes. "Peppa, Peppa, where are you?" Mummy called out. She picked up the toy. For a moment, it seemed like Labubu winked at her and whispered quietly in a familiar voice, "I'm here, Mummy. I'll always be here." A week later, George found a strange toy in his room, a small yellow monster with big black eyes. And that same day, a second window appeared in his room. "Dinosaur! Dinosaur!" George exclaimed. "No, George, I'm Labubu, and soon you'll be Labubu too," the toy replied. In the forest beyond the window stood a figure that looked very much like Peppa, but with yellow skin and black eyes. She waved at George and smiled with Labubu's horrifying smile. Be careful with toys that appear out of nowhere. Sometimes they don't come to be played with, but to turn you into a toy. It was very early in the morning when Peppa first heard it. She was sleeping peacefully in her bed when a soft, rhythmic knocking came from her bedroom door. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard a voice, monotone and strange, repeating the same phrase over and over, "Tun, tun, tun, sahur." Peppa sat up in her bed, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Who's there?" she called out, but the knocking continued. "Tun, tun, tun, sahur," came the voice again, louder this time. Curiosity got the better of her fear, and Peppa slowly approached the door. When she opened it, she gasped. Standing in the hallway was a strange yellow creature with large round eyes and a wooden stick in its hand. The creature looked at Peppa with those unblinking eyes and said just one word: "Sahur." Before Peppa could ask any questions, the creature turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Peppa closed the door quickly, her heart pounding, but sleep would not come again that night. The next morning at breakfast, Peppa tried to tell her family about the strange visitor. "Mummy, Daddy, someone came to my room this morning. They were knocking and saying tun 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 sahur," she explained excitedly. Daddy Pig just laughed. "Peppa, you must have been dreaming. Sahur is just a morning meal that some people have. Your imagination is getting the better of you." Mummy Pig nodded in agreement. "Yes, dear, don't make up scary stories. Now eat your breakfast." But just as they were talking, a rhythmic tapping sound came from outside the house. "Tap! Tap! Tap!" Peppa jumped up from her chair. "Do you hear that?" "That's him!" she cried. The family listened, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Later that day, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when the yellow creature appeared again. It emerged from behind the bushes, still carrying its wooden stick, and began walking slowly around their yard. "Tun, tun, tun," it said monotonously, tapping the stick against the ground with each word. George hid behind Peppa, frightened by the strange visitor. Peppa, though scared, tried to be brave. "What do you want?" she asked. The creature stopped and looked at her. It held out its stick, offering it to Peppa. "Sahur," it said simply. Peppa didn't take the stick. She watched as the creature continued its slow walk around the garden, tapping and chanting its mysterious phrase. That night, Peppa had terrible nightmares. She dreamed she was trapped in a dark room, surrounded by dozens of yellow creatures, all carrying sticks and chanting "Tun Tun Tun Sahur" in perfect unison. When she woke up in a cold sweat, she looked out her window and saw the creature standing in the garden, staring up at her room. Days passed, and something strange began happening to Peppa's family. They became quiet and listless. Every morning they would sit at the breakfast table in complete silence, eating their food without speaking, then drift apart to their rooms like sleepwalkers. One morning, Peppa watched in horror as Daddy Pig picked up a wooden spoon and began tapping it against the table. "Tun, tun, tun," he said in the same monotone voice as the creature. Soon, Mummy Pig joined in, and then George, all of them tapping and chanting together. The final morning came when Peppa ran outside, desperate to escape the strange behavior of her family. But what she saw in the garden made her blood run cold. The entire yard was filled with yellow creatures, all holding wooden sticks. In the center stood her family, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and little George, each holding a stick of their own. They all turned to look at Peppa with blank, emotionless eyes. "Tun, tun, tun, sahur," they chanted in unison, their voices blending with those of the creatures around them. One of the yellow beings approached Peppa and held out a wooden stick. Peppa looked at her transformed family, then at the stick being offered to her. She realized there was no escape, no way back to the life she once knew. Slowly, with trembling hands, Peppa reached out and took the stick. "Sahur," she whispered, her voice already beginning to match the monotone of the others. And so Peppa joined her new family, walking slowly around the garden with the yellow creatures, tapping her stick and chanting the endless phrase that had consumed them all. The morning ritual had claimed another victim, and somewhere in the distance the sound of "Tun Tun Tun Sahur" continued to echo, waiting for the next family to find. Night fell over Peppa Pig's house. It all began ordinarily, dinner, casual conversation, but something hung in the air. Peppa felt her parents were acting differently. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig sat at the table too quietly. Their eyes reflected the light of the lamp, but inside, there was nothing, like two glass orbs, no emotions, no warmth. Peppa pushed her plate away, a lump stuck in her throat. George, usually restless, sat silently, clutching his dinosaur tightly. The silence at the table was so heavy that the ticking of the hallway clock sounded like hammer strikes. Later, deep in the night, Peppa woke to a strange sound. Something rustled dully in the corridor. She woke George, and together, they cautiously left their room. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker of a lamp from the living room. They came closer and peeked through the crack in the door, and froze. Mummy and Daddy Pig stood in the middle of the room, motionless, like statues. Their bodies swayed slightly, as if held by invisible strings. Their eyes were completely black, without a glimmer, and their smiles stretched from ear to ear. "Go back to bed," came Daddy Pig's voice. But it sounded hollow, like an echo in a cave. It was his voice, and at the same time, not his. The children stumbled back and ran to their room. Peppa hid under the blanket and couldn't sleep for a long time. It seemed like the shadows on the walls were moving on their own. The morning only made things worse. At breakfast, Daddy Pig smiled too wide, showing sharp teeth that had never been there before. Mummy moved around the kitchen with unnerving grace, her steps too smooth, too perfect, like a rehearsal of a dance. Peppa glanced at George, but he only shook his head. He was scared. At that moment, something shifted outside the window. First, a shadow, enormous, covering half the yard. Then a heavy step that made the dishes on the table rattle. And then Peppa saw him, Bombardiro Crocodilo, but not the one she once knew. His eyes glowed scarlet, his jaws slightly open, and every tooth shone like a blade. His massive body moved slowly, but each step echoed deep through the ground. He drew closer to the house, and with every lash of his tail, the walls trembled. Peppa shrank back from the window in horror. Mummy and Daddy didn't react. They continued their movements, as if programmed. Suddenly, a voice rang out. Not from her parents, not from outside. It sounded directly inside Peppa's head, low and crushing. "You're watching this. Press the hype button below the video before it's too late." Peppa gasped in terror. It felt like those words weren't meant only for her, as if Bombardiro Crocodilo himself was speaking to someone else, watching alongside her. She grabbed George's hand, and they ran into the corridor. But it was darker than usual. Doors that had never existed appeared along the walls. From each came whispers and rasping breaths. Bulbs flickered and went out one by one. From the living room came a scraping sound. The children froze. Suddenly, Mummy Pig stepped into the corridor. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her smile was far too wide, her eyes completely empty. Behind her appeared Daddy. They walked in sync, without hesitation. "Children must obey," they said together in one voice. Peppa and George rushed to the front door, but Bombardiro's silhouette was already outside the glass. His shadow blocked out all the light. His breathing rumbled like a volcano. He tilted his head, and his scarlet eyes blazed even brighter. "We are waiting!" his voice thundered. The door swung open on its own, and a cold wind swept inside. But it wasn't the wind. It was the breath of the crocodilo. It dragged darkness behind it, filling the entire corridor. Peppa screamed, but the sound drowned in the roar. George cowered behind her, his hands shaking. Mummy and Daddy stepped closer, their bodies distorted, merging with the shadows. They no longer seemed to belong to the world of the living. Bombardiro raised his claw and struck the ground. The house shuddered. Windows cracked. The chandelier swayed. He took another step forward, and at that moment, everything around began to warp. Rooms vanished, walls stretched and collapsed, turning into an endless corridor. Peppa clutched her brother and shut her eyes. But even through her eyelids, she saw the red glow of his eyes. The last thing she heard was the sound of a broken melody, like the beat of a heart, and a deep, triumphant growl. "Now you are mine." And the night swallowed everything. A gift for George. George really wanted a new toy. His favorite dinosaur had broken, and the boy was sad all day long. Mummy Pig decided to cheer up her son and took him to a new toy store on the outskirts of town. The store was strange. Dim lighting, creaky shelves, and the shopkeeper, an elderly pig with cloudy eyes, spoke very quietly, almost in a whisper. "Choose any toy, dear," said Mummy Pig. George wandered between the shelves, looking at bright toys, but his gaze was drawn to one special figure in the far corner, a small creature with big dark eyes and a wide smile. The tag read "Labubu." "I want this one," said George, pointing at the toy. The shopkeeper looked strangely at the boy, then at Mummy Pig. "Are you sure? This toy is special. It requires special care." "What do you mean?" asked Mummy Pig. "Nothing special, just be attentive to the child's behavior." Mummy Pig shrugged and bought Labubu. George was delighted. He hugged the toy to himself all the way home, and Labubu seemed to look directly at him with her motionless eyes. At home, George immediately ran to his room to play with the new toy. He sat Labubu on the bed and began telling her about his favorite games. "You'll be my best friend," said George. And then it seemed to him that Labubu nodded slightly. The first few days everything was normal. George played with Labubu, carried her everywhere, even slept, hugging her. But gradually his behavior began to change. First, George became very quiet. He stopped running around the house, shouting and laughing. Instead, he sat for hours in his room, quietly talking to Labubu. "Who are you talking to in there?" asked Peppa, peeking in on her brother. "With Labubu. She tells me interesting stories." "But it's just a toy, George." "No, she's real. She talks to me." Peppa looked at the toy. Labubu sat on the bed with the same wide smile, but something about her pose seemed wrong to Peppa, as if the toy was watching her. Then George began saying strange things. He told his parents about a dark forest where Labubu lived, about other children who played there forever. He said that Labubu showed him this world in dreams. "I like it there," George said with a distant look. "It's always dark and quiet there. And no one shouts." His parents became worried. George began avoiding sunlight, preferring to sit in dark corners. He stopped eating his favorite food and barely slept at night. One night, Mummy Pig heard George talking in his room. She quietly approached the door and listened. "Yes, Labubu, I understand. I want to stay with you forever. Your world is much better." Mummy Pig entered the room. George sat on the bed holding Labubu in his hands. His eyes were wide open, but his gaze was empty, as if he was looking through his mother. "George, who are you talking to?" "With Labubu. She says she'll take me to her place soon. We'll play in her world where it's always night." Mummy Pig felt a chill. She took Labubu from her son's hands. The toy was ice cold, even though George had been holding it in his warm hands. "I think you need to rest from this toy for a while," said Mummy, and took Labubu to another room. George screamed like never before. He cried and begged to return Labubu, said he couldn't live without her. At night, Mummy Pig woke up to a strange sound, quiet footsteps in the corridor. She left the bedroom and saw George walking toward the room where Labubu lay. The boy moved strangely, like a sleepwalker. His eyes were closed. "George!" called Mummy, but the boy didn't react. He reached the room, took Labubu, and returned to his room. In the morning, he didn't remember how it happened. The parents decided to get rid of the toy. They took Labubu back to the store, But the shopkeeper only smiled mysteriously. "She'll return," he said. "They always return to their children." And indeed, the next day, Labubu was back in George's room. No one knew how she got there. Each day, George became more distant. He almost stopped talking to his family, spending all his time with Labubu. His skin became pale, and his eyes lost their shine. One morning, the parents went into George's room to wake him up, but the bed was empty. Only Labubu lay on the pillow with her unchanging smile. George was nowhere to be found. The search continued for weeks, but the boy seemed to have vanished into thin air, and Labubu remained in the house, waiting for the next child who would want to play with her.